Iridium is more than just a satellite company, making connections anywhere, to anything, or anyone. With an upgraded, state-of-the-art constellation, complemented by decades of experience, Iridium brings new energy and a forward-looking vision to the industry. There's no other network like it. Operating in low Earth orbit, Iridium is still the only commercial satellite system where calls and data are passed from satellite to satellite. The network provides low-latency, weather-resilient services to the whole planet. Safety and reliability are in Iridium's DNA. Trusted by people and organizations in some of the world's most challenging environments, Iridium remains committed to helping make the world a safer place. And Iridium continues to innovate beyond satellite phones. The flexible Iridium Certus platform provides voice and data access at the fastest L-band speeds available. Iridium is also enabling the technology of the future, from real-time tracking to command and control for autonomous systems, and simplifying IoT application development beyond cellular networks. And all of this is made possible through Iridium's growing ecosystem of over 450 industry-leading companies around the world. As we look to the future, the possibilities are endless.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Berman, the host of the Cyber Hero Adventures Show. Thanks so much for who you are and what you do and why you do it. Today, we have an incredibly important and impressive group of thought leaders. We're going to talk about securing space. Are we actually going to be able to defend the digital universe? We're going to hear all about that and a lot more, beginning with our first guest, Matt Desch, CEO of Iridium. Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Gary.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I see you have a basketball behind you. Is that what is that about?
That's to make me look athletic, Gary. Yeah, it's been a few years and my feet have worked well enough to use that, but someone gave that to me 20 years ago and it looks really good right there. That's my story and I'm sticking with it.
Well, okay. You don't really know me yet. This is the first time that you've been on our show, but let me do the humor and then you do the substance. That way we kind of stay in our lanes.
It's hard, but I'll try to avoid.
Can you share with us a little bit about your origin story, which is a term we use in comic creation, and my audience knows we do superhero comics. So what's your origin story?
Well, my personal one, I mean, I've been in telecommunications for, most of my 40-year career here in wireless communications from 1G, on going back a long, long way from starting at Bell Labs and working at Nortel Networks and starting and working the wireless industry. I got into Iridium 15 years ago, thinking this was a very unique company that was quite famous in the 90s, not for being successful, but for sort of creating the first system in low Earth orbit that made personal communication connections between people, from then satellite phones today. The Internet of Things is our big business, and connecting ships and airplanes and militaries and first responders and lots and lots of other things as a successful company. Turns out to be space is a lot of fun and interesting, and we've had an interesting year, 15 years, as we've grown to become quite a successful company, from our auspicious start many years ago, running still the only network that covers every part of the planet today from low Earth orbit. Got a brand new network that we just spent $3 billion on and want to protect, which is why this is an important topic to us, as you can imagine. Just finished launching a whole second generation network on SpaceX rockets and put them into operation several years ago. And now we're sort of exploiting the power of that new platform everywhere on Earth. And I should say, we want to protect our network, which is why this is an important topic to us. We want to protect our partners' networks who use our network to go to service, but also we have such a unique network and service that we have been using our network to protect ground infrastructure too. So may get a chance to talk a little bit about that. For example, how we are interested in alternate position navigation and timing, and how some of our efforts of our network go into protecting infrastructure on the ground, particularly the timing aspects of that infrastructure, because of our spot in low Earth orbit and our ability to connect efficiently to things. We can send timing information that could perhaps help things protect themselves in a jamming or spoofing kind of environment. So lots of stuff to talk about here, I know on your show, but it's certainly been interesting and important to really, and been frankly an area of great investment of over a lot of that 15 years that I've been at Iridium, is to make sure that our network is secure.
Indeed, and it's incredibly important. I mean, we take things like GPS for granted, but you look at all the use cases for it, some of which you just described, climate, just the weather. I mean, what is 200 feet for an airplane? If it's off by 200 feet, is what's going to go wrong? I mean, the stuff you deal with is just mission critical for all of life, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, you think if you're a climatologist, you're a scientist, or you're an explorer, you're anywhere, and you like to make a connection to keep yourself safe or to send your data back and forth, or there's a buoy in the ocean measuring the salinity, and in fact, there's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those things around there. All those missions need a connection to the internet, usually, certainly connection to people. And everybody thinks the cell phone network now, after 35, 40 years of operation, should be covering the whole planet, but in fact, it only covers, by my calculation, something like 12% of the Earth's surface.
Really? That's amazing.
13%. And by the way, we're excited about 5G, and 5G is really, really cool and fantastic, the speeds it could give us and maybe new applications, but it's really going in that 12 to 13%. It's not expanding the footprint at all much right now. So satellites really are the thing that make the connections to airplane, ships, anything beyond that. Iridium has been one of many satellite companies going after that. We're going after that market in a very, very unique and special way, but still we're making those connections, especially for all those things that, the biggest market, the biggest growth area for us is the Internet of Things market, or making connections to things instead of people, though we make a lot of connections to people as well. And to do that, you need an efficient connection from someplace, and up in space is the best place to do it. And the only place really to do it, if you're in the middle of the ocean or in the desert, or frankly, about 40 to 50% of the U.S. Doesn't get a good cell phone connection. So if you're FedEx, you really want to track that package, or UPS or something, and know exactly where it is. You might want to depend on something besides just the cell phone network.
Well, yeah, indeed. And, one of the interesting things that I've had the privilege to listen and learn about are the vulnerability of IoT devices themselves, just because of the low price point and the battery, issues and the size of things. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in IoT devices. So we'll be able to delve into that as it relates to space with some of our other folks. I wanted to cover off on one other point before I bring in our next guest, which is kind of how you and I met. I happened to be just doing some work, and I had 60 Minutes on in the background, and I heard someone talking about space junk, not a term I had really ever thought about, and I whipped my head around, and it was you. So tell our audience about space junk. Like, can you dimensionalize that for our audience? How many pieces of space junk are there?
Yeah, my interest in security goes beyond cyber. It goes to protecting our network and protecting the infrastructure, protecting obviously our sites and everything else from a physical and other perspective.
Right.
And you can imagine when your assets are going at 17,000 miles an hour, every 100 minutes around the planet, 500 miles above you, those assets are quite important in protecting them. When in 2009 we were one of the first satellites that got hit by something else in space. In the 60 years that things have been going around the Earth ever since Sputnik, was the first satellite. So when that happened, it was a bad day, and it created some space debris. But there was also other things that can create space debris. Actually, people are talking about shooting stuff out and have shot stuff out of space from the ground, called ASATs. There are many other threats in space that we're concerned about that even have sort of generated the need for something in the U.S. called the Space Force. As people thought about putting more energy and emphasis into space as a separate domain that kind of things could happen in. So, yeah, we're very interested in space debris. We're very interested in not having any more of it because it's very difficult to remove what's in space right now. So I get asked a lot for opinions about that. We want to keep people from making any more of it is the number one thing. Glad to see people innovating to take stuff out of space, but that's the business case isn't there and won't be there. Fortunately, gravity does help our situation a little bit, but it takes a long time. And if we don't make any more, but even a satellite like ours in really low Earth orbit, if you don't do anything and if it dies, we'll be up there for about 120 years, slowly coming down.
Wow.
A satellite just a little bit higher than us, like a OneWeb satellite, could take 1,000 years to come down, even though it's only up about 1,400 kilometers. Some satellites in geostationary or whatever just get pushed out, when they get old into a graveyard orbit, and will be up there technically forever. So got to really be careful because there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of little pieces up there, and that is one of the many issues we worry about. In our case, I will say, just so people realize this isn't an impossible problem, space is, even in low Earth orbit alone, is incredibly huge. It's hard to kind of give people the appreciation. Even all that debris up there that you can see in pictures, if you put it all, could probably all fit into an ocean tanker. Fortunately, it isn't all in an ocean tanker. It's like bullets flying around independently in pieces, and a paint chip can do a lot of damage. So it's not, and there's just a lot of space up there. But we can't rely on that, because if for some chance things got to be a chain reaction in some way, that would create a lot of problems and make space unusable for all of us, which is not something we want to see happen.
Wow, that is incredibly interesting. And speaking of incredibly interesting, I want to invite to the show Sam Visner. Sam is a technical fellow over at MITRE and very involved with the space ISAC, to be sure. Hey, Sam, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for having me, Gary. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you know what? I was just talking to you the other day, and you're the first guest that has been with us 4 times. So now this will be your 5th time, so we have to give you some kind of jacket. I'll give you a cape. What color cape would you like? And a mask?
Well, if my superhero outfit, Gary, will look like you. So that'll be my preference.
I wouldn't insult you that way. No. So Sam, would you be kind enough just to share with our audience a little bit about your origin story? It's incredibly interesting for sure.
Well, thank you, Gary. I'll try to be brief, mercifully. I've been in the business of cyber one way or the other for many years. I was a young CIA officer. That goes back, 40 years or so. Got into the private sector, ran some cybersecurity businesses, served as chief of signals intelligence programs at the National Security Agency, ran more cybersecurity businesses. And now I teach at Georgetown University as well as an adjunct. I teach a course on cybersecurity policy, operations, and technology. And in addition to that, I've picked up the responsibilities as a member of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is the industry-specific center that works on space security and resilience. And I think my late mother was right she feared I would never be able to hold a job, and I think my career is good evidence of that. My family and I have been in the national security business ever since. Well, my dad was, as you may know, was a physicist on the Manhattan Project, and I was born in Oak Ridge. So, the idea of working on national security is something that with which I've grown up, and I think it continues to be part of the family DNA.
Indeed. And while you may have had many jobs, you have only had one mission, which is what you're talking about, and that's to defend this country. And that's one of the unifying themes of our show and our work, to shine the light on the unsung cyber heroes who toil in anonymity to keep us safe. So thanks so much for who you are and what you do and why you go about doing it. So tell us a little bit more about the Space ISAC and its mission. Where are things in that development? How's it going? How can we help?
Sure. But before we do that, I do want to do a call out to the unsung heroes who are now working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week under the most adverse and dangerous conditions. And of course, I'm speaking of our service men and women, yes, particularly those who are right now at that airport in Kabul, who are in essence in the most dangerous situation, saving tens of thousands of lives. They really are the unsung heroes. Those of us sitting here today should certainly do a hat tip to those people. They're really the heroes. My own origin story really is that I've always been interested in national security. So when the Space ISAC was stood up in late 2019, and it was established based on interest at the White House at that time, it seemed like something I would need to support. The ISAC itself is comprised of many of the leading companies in the space systems business, companies that build and design and launch and engineer and operate space systems, whether or not they're for communications like Iridium, geodesy, resource mapping, imagery, or any other mission in space, including eventually travel, manufacturing, and eventually tourism. Our job is to share information about the threat, as well as share information about best practices that can be used to protect the security and resilience of our space system. So, Gary, what we have now are working groups working on information sharing, supply chain risk management, and other aspects of space cybersecurity and resilience. We have a set of founding board members, and now an ever-expanding group of companies that have joined. Microsoft is one of the latest, and others are in the pipeline to join us. We've built enduring and I think in very robust relationships with the government, including now we have an operating agreement with the Department of Homeland Security, and they're sharing information with us, which in turn we share with our members, and we're working to establish additional relationships with other parts of the federal government, including the Department of Defense. We also have members from overseas, and we're working with some of this nation's international partners. I've been meeting with our government to ensure that we understand the U.S. national interest in space as it relates to working globally and with other countries. And our membership and our contacts are expanding to other companies, overseas, as well as contacts and discussions we're having with their counterparts to our NASA and our space authorities here. You can see the effect of all of this activity. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has released a new draft framework on space systems cybersecurity. We think that's a great development. There is a discussion underway as to whether or not space systems should be critical infrastructure. Legislation to that effect requiring the designation has been introduced on a bipartisan basis by by Congressman Liu and Congressman Calvert, and members of the Space ISAC. Many of us are certainly salute that act and have written and spoken rather extensively on this. So the ISAC itself has achieved a lot of critical mass. Our threat information sharing platform achieved IOC in February, which I think is remarkable because we were stood up only in late 2019, and by February 2021, We have IOC for our operational capability. We see ourselves, Gary, as more operational than anything, although we are now beginning to look at where we can identify and support challenges in the research and technology area as well. So again, I think this has been it's been a fantastic ride. It's one I didn't anticipate. As a kid, I was hoping I'd be in my life able to fly in space. I think that may not happen, but supporting the security and resilience of what we do in space, for me, may be the next best thing. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do it. Thank you.
Indeed. One of the interesting things that I've had the privilege of listening and learning about is in the criminal world, whether it be nation states or individual actors or gangs, they share information freely. They're horizontally structured, in the way that they do that, and they don't have the same constraints that the defenders have, who are more vertically structured, such as intellectual property or government rules and regulations and things like that. And it seems to me that's where the ISACs are standing up and where they sit. Is that an accurate sort of assessment?
It's an excellent point, Gary, and I'm glad you made it. Yes, it's one of the things that we do best. We just held the second of our series of tabletop exercises to explore what are the challenges for information sharing, particularly if there's an emergency, and whether or not we can lower the cut line. In other words, get companies to share information that otherwise they wouldn't share, that's above the line, that's proprietary, if an emergency should take place, and whether or not an emergency would serve as sufficient justification and motivation, inspiration to share more information. And in this country, information sharing is subject to law, right? You can't just share criminal information. There are things like chain of custody. The criminals don't have those constraints. They don't worry about these things. We, of course, because we are a nation of laws and hopefully law-abiding people and organizations, we try very hard to observe these limitations. But at the same time, the need to share information dynamically, particularly in an emergency, has never been greater. So operating within those constraints, but trying to be as efficient as possible, is a large part of our mission and that of our members.
Indeed. And, one of the amazing sort of privileges of this kind of work is, we've created now the Cyber Hero Network. And the word network has a double meaning to it. One is broadcasts and things like this, but the other one is connecting very high level mission-driven people to one another. So for the greater good. And so I would be remiss if I didn't put it out there that maybe there's someone on this show who may or may not be members of the ISAC, or someone in our audience who is may or may not be members of the ISAC to jump in. It's an incredibly important mission, and it's only going to become more so as we go forward. So speaking of jumping in, let me introduce Max Justice to our audience. Hey, Max, welcome to the show. Oh, I think you're muted here, yeah.
Yeah, great to be here, Gary. Thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it.
Indeed. And Max, you were one of the first people I had the privilege of listening and learning from a long time ago. I was saying, I remember after, our discussion, I said, wow, I mean, if this is the level of people and the type of people that are defending, this country and our assets, we have a lot to be optimistic about. And the thing to me that was incredibly interesting about you and your background, which I'd love for you to share your origin story now, is what you're doing with mushrooms. So, and your sort of handle or your superhero name is the Cyber Farmer, right?
Yes. And really, the Cyber Farmer, it's all about sowing seeds of cybersecurity. And Sam touched on it earlier. It's being open and sharing information freely. And that's really what I do. And so I am a subcontractor to Peraton. I'm with the Abile Group as the NASA Sense Security SME. I am not speaking on behalf of NASA, so please hope everyone understands that. My background, while it's been I just think about so many different things, much like the guests that you have on in the show, which I'm thoroughly impressed with. And boy, hard act to follow between Sam and Matt. I'm really impressed. I joined the military before I even graduated high school. I went into Army basic training between my junior and senior years of high school. Thought the Army wasn't gung-ho enough and went in the Marine Corps and protected our nation as a Marine. And so, like Sam, I'm very much concerned with our brothers and sisters that are over in a hostile area trying to leave a Afghan peacefully. So I do think about that often. In fact, I mentor a lot of our folks transitioning out of the military. Is one of the things I do. Very happy about. How I got to where I am today, boy, it's a long story. I don't want to necessarily go into everything, but it was really a lot of hard work and a little bit of dumb luck. You know, I was born a hillbilly and could barely speak English. And now here I am working on my PhD in cybersecurity. And my dissertation is going to be on innovation of the hacker, especially as it relates to space-based systems. Because nowadays hackers can break into satellites with $300 worth of equipment. And
did you say 300? Forgive the interruption. Did you say $300?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. In fact, there is you can do a quick YouTube search called "Hacking for Satellites" by Freethink, and they go into a great detail about how somebody can hack a satellite with $300 worth of equipment. And so that's really scary. And it's one of the reasons why I've written a paper, passed it around DHS. In fact, Sam has written a very detailed paper for the Space Foundation. But we both really are interested in making space the 17th critical infrastructure. And that's really what my personal mission is to help ensure.
And Max, since you brought that up, and we have Matt here. Matt, what do you think about what we just heard about this nominal amount of money? I mean,
well, I Max is smarter than I am, but it is possible that that a poorly protected satellite system can be hacked by a small amount, and I think there's talking about very specific satellites and very specific situations at that time. If it only took $300, all we would be doing was being hacked all day long by all kinds of people, and we're not, right now. While we are, we've spent an awful lot of money, time, and energy creating a network, partitioning a network, creating, and make it very, very difficult for that. I think when they do that, they're really talking about very specific links that can happen. For example, our user links could be intercepted, but we don't try to secure them. We don't try to create encryption because our partners will encrypt things, for example, themselves over those network or
right.
And so that's all the time. There'll be some people doing sensationalistic stuff in hacker conferences showing what they can do, when in fact you could practically let us know and we can tell you how to get a paging number or something from our network here. That was never meant to be protected. Our network, our core network, though, would be very difficult to breach. In fact, we try to make it impossible and don't have the issues there. So anyway, I support, though, completely what Max is saying in terms of the importance of satellite infrastructure. Everybody usually points immediately to GPS and just how dependent, there's more GPS receivers on the ground than there are toothbrushes in the world, I've been told, which is a scary thought. It either means that there's not a lot of people brushing their teeth, or frankly, we use GPS for everything. I mean, people don't appreciate GPS. The timing signal is as important as the location signal, because we use the timing in our base stations, for all those 5G and 4G connections that we make.
Right.
We use the New York Stock Exchange. We use it to connect the power grid and all the other really critical assets. So if those things are jammed or toyed with, or just that simple thing, which we don't do, we don't provide that service. That's another network that provides that. You could imagine just the havoc that could be created. So it is very, very important to protect space services, space assets, and whatnot. And frankly, a lot of the critical things that happen in the world, mentioning what's going on over in Afghanistan, quite a bit of concern as we We know our network is being used there quite a bit. It's being used in Haiti right now by all those people that are affected there to rescue people,
Right.
weather emergencies. There's just so many places right now in the world that need connectivity, and you really wouldn't want to see someone toying with those things or breaking them somehow.
Yeah, indeed. And so speaking of, wireless, let me bring to the show Scott Schober. His superhero name we came up with previously. You want to say it, Scott, or should I? You're muted. You're muted right now. But while he's unmuting, let me introduce to our audience Scott, the wireless warrior Schober. He's CEO of BBS Systems, and they actually manufacture stuff. He's very rare in my world. Most of the people that I listen and learn from or part of our network are in the software or engineering kinds of things. He does engineer, but he actually makes cool stuff. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Yeah, great to be here.
Tell us some of the stuff you're working on.
Yeah, our company is kind of an interesting company. We focus on niche wireless design and manufacturing for actually all the companies that are on here are actual customers of ours and many others. We do a lot of work for DoD agencies and certainly anything to do with security and wireless, where there's a cross there. So we call it cyber wireless threat detection tools. Often where there's a SCIF that houses classified information, our tools, our black boxes will actually scan and look for any possible wireless threats. So that's a core part of our business. But a fair amount of our other stuff to do is actually a lot with timing for ground-based timing, I should say, with satellite networks and other timing solutions that we've built over the years that often is used in conjunction with some of these larger projects that you're talking about. And then I focus a lot on the cybersecurity side. So a concern that I have in line with a lot of the stuff that already these great guests have been talking about is really the vulnerabilities that are out there in the world of satellites and some of the things that have been done to really shore that up so they're not targets and they're not compromised. And the way I look at it is so many billions of dollars have been invested in this vital communication means that we're all dependent upon on the globe, that it has to be kept secure and safe. And I'm very glad that they're doing a lot of things to actually make a difference here. In contrast to a number of years ago, I think there were a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities. Now they're actually addressing these things from day one, as opposed to waiting and trying to patch things and fix these vulnerabilities later on in life, which really just means it's going to be a safer planet for us. And it's going to be a lot harder for these cyber criminals to really get into the satellite network. So it's good things and it's important things that will keep us safe. And it's part of national security now.
Indeed. And recently, Max, I read something, and I just want to check in with you on this, or any of our friends here can opine on it, which is that the dwell time, which is the amount of time that criminals or hackers are inside the system, has gone down considerably. I don't know the exact numbers, but it used to be like 260 days down to like a month. Does anyone have insights into that?
Well,
yes, Scott?
Well, in part, just to keep in mind, I think it's because a lot of the more advanced attacks, what they're doing now is they're jumping onto systems working laterally, and they're more adept at collecting and stealing information and then getting off or covering up their trails. In part, a lot of the cyber attacks, it's because they're chasing certainly ransomware attacks, but then they have a vehicle to now extort, where they'll just basically download all of that data and get off the system so they can later on extort and then sell that information on the dark web. And those hybrid attacks are starting to surface more and more, which are concerning, which I think is part of the reason why the actual dwell time for the attack is starting to shorten. They're getting better at what they're doing, and they're using the data more for putting money in their pockets.
I think that's right. I think if you take a look at some things like a large corporation or a government agency that's treated essentially as an intelligence target, the dwell time remains very high. But for cyber criminals who essentially are opportunistic, unless it's a complex network where they have to do extensive reconnaissance before they exfiltrate data, it is exactly as Scott says. It's a smash and grab. And they want to be out before they are detected, because if they are detected, people may change or invalidate the information they've stolen in some way. So The effort has, in essence, has been, particularly with organizations that have a big attack surface, get in, steal what you're going to steal, get out. And the first time the organization knows that this has happened to them is when they receive perhaps a ransom demand.
Right.
So I wouldn't take much solace in the idea that the dwell time, which was something like 260, 270 days, has diminished. For some organizations, it probably has not. But for smaller organizations or those that are the subject essentially of opportunistic theft, it's probably gone down because the criminals are really quite effective.
Yeah, indeed. And just for our audience, to get more information about how to combat the criminals by being part of the ISAC, you see the URL is there in the lower left hand corner of our screen, which we'll leave up for a little bit. So Max, let me just turn back to you for just a moment. We mentioned earlier about your work with mushrooms, and maybe for our audience may not see a link to that end space, so maybe you can
Sure.
just amplify that.
Sure. So, yes, I am a mushroom farmer. Gourmet mushrooms, by the way, especially for those in the community. The funny mushrooms I don't deal with. However, what's amazing about mushrooms is several things. One, the way it grows, the mycelium branches out like a neural network. And so the relationship to technology and mycelium growth is absolutely there because they grow in similar patterns. And the same with your brain. So with my brain being a little bit different, I know that there are many alternatives that people are looking to for mushrooms currently. Whether it's building materials such as bricks and sound boards or soundproof boards, as well as people are using it for clothing now, and even a replacement for bacon. But one thing I want to do is actually I want to build a satellite based out of mycelium and launch it into space. And if I can do that within the next 5 years, that would be hitting a major milestone for myself.
Is this something that NASA is supporting?
So NASA has another person who has a CIBR contract, had that CIBR contract for a couple of years, and she is doing some research with mushrooms or mycelium, but not necessarily making the satellite itself, the structure out of mycelium. And if you took mycelium and carbon nanotubes, you make about the strongest yet most flexible item known to man. And Matt talked about it earlier. We have all of this debris out in space. Well, one of the reasons is we make really weak satellites, and they can come apart with a paint chip at times. So we need to make something that is stronger, flexible, but also has some sustainability to it. We only have so many resources in this world that we can use, and if we can use a biodegradable, bio-made resource, then the sky's the limit. And mushrooms came from space, and they can go back into space.
Wow, that's so interesting. We have some breaking news. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, they have a record of operational satellites. There are 6,542 in space, out of which about 3,300 are active, and the rest are not. What do you think?
Now, that number is it's probably close to accurate. However, I would say that we do have some classified satellites up there that aren't recorded in that number.
I would imagine. So Matt, what's your thought about that, about the density of satellites? And from what I understand, the cost of launching satellites is going down considerably, maybe because of reusable rockets, things like that. What's your kind of overall assessment of the state of satellites in the world right now?
Well, the interest in space has really grown dramatically over the last 5 years. There is an explosion of investment right now around putting constellations of satellites in. When we were, when we were started late 90s, early 2000s, LEO wasn't cool. It was viewed as a place for only the, really frankly, the US and Russian government satellites. And besides that, it just wasn't cost effective. Today, everyone is getting into it, and that number isn't a very high number. There's something like 25,000 to 35,000 satellites that, if the money keeps flowing, will flow into space in the coming years.
Wow.
That being said, that's not necessarily a concern. I worry about a little bit the over dramatization of it. I want people to be pragmatic and practical about the issue. This is a issue a little bit probably like climate change was back in the 1970s. If we might have taken it seriously back then, we might not be kind of where we are today. That's not a political statement. That's just, the Earth is getting a little warmer, that sort of thing.
Right.
And it's the same way with space. In 50 years, it could be a very big concern, not because of the 27,000 satellites, but if they're put up there poorly, if communication between operators isn't very smooth, and there's a lot going on, but there's a lot of people who aren't talking to each other. If satellites don't have propulsion, if they're put at the same altitudes, it's amazing there aren't even some basic rules of the road up there. Fortunately, more North American and European operators we know are mostly doing the right thing. There aren't any terrible actors you can just necessarily point to, but there are a lot of people who we aren't in discussion with and have a lot of communication, know what their plans are, and they're not coordinating with us in other governments, in other places of the world, et cetera. So our concern is long-term. There is no magic vacuum in space like Spaceballs might have shown you there to be.
Right.
There is, so it's no immediate threat, but there's no immediate solution either. There is no cost-effective way of, you can take a rocket body out of space, but that only reduces the problem by 0.001%. So it's a concern that we worry that with all this investment pouring into the category, that there'll be some, as I call them, perverse incentives for people to possibly put up, junk up there that or that isn't controllable, or they're not in conjunction and talking to others. And so, my main message has been to, maybe some rules of the road might be appropriate for us. I'm not, the challenge is, though, getting the world to agree upon them. It's as big a challenge as climate change was. Why bother if some other government isn't going to follow them? Why should we follow them? Space is very expensive to get into, even with lowering launch costs. And by the way, the costs aren't so much that they're lowering, it's just that there are more and more rockets being developed that are specially created for a purpose, especially launching small satellites. So the
Right.
cost is being tailored more effectively. It's not just reusability, it's just really the competition's going up in the rocket launch area. But it is easier to get things into space, and people are launching less reliable things into space. It's not that things have just magically gotten smaller. People have decided to take out a lot of the redundancies and say, these don't need to last for 20 years. I only want them to last for 5 years. Now, fortunately, someone like Starlink, for example, a lot of people point to them, but at least they decided to launch at a very, very low altitude, so that if bad things happen 2 or 3 years later, they'll re-enter. And I think that was very responsible. And they are maneuvering satellites. In fact, today they mentioned how many times they're maneuvering. Their satellites are smart and are trying to move around. And I think that they're doing a good job. But somebody else could launch into the exact same altitude that they're launching, the same orbital altitude, and nobody necessarily could. I mean, there are some agencies which won't approve that, obviously, but other people could decide to do it because they thought that there was a need to, and there's no global laws that would stop that. So,
indeed, forgive the interruption, but Sam, I noticed you were nodding in agreement when you're hearing about this. Can you amplify a little bit Matt's thinking about the need for some overall rules of the road in space? You're muted, Sorry.
Sorry, Matt raises some excellent points, and I agree with him. The difficulty is in getting this agreement. I'm working on a paper now with a colleague of mine at MITRE, Dr. Peter Scharfman, who's a political scientist, discussing whether or not and how one might develop norms of behavior for satellite system security. And it turns out that's not necessarily going to be easy. There are some things that can be done because there are some norms being observed. For example, nation states are not, while they've demonstrated the capacity to attack each other's systems, by and large, they haven't done so, particularly for systems that are part of early warning and command and control. Such an act could be interpreted as presaging an act of war. And, you know, if you're going to do that, you want to be very careful that you don't actually send the wrong signal. Nonetheless, it's not going to be easy. Even establishing norms in cyber security for more generally hasn't been easy, as the global group of experts at the UN can attest. Nonetheless, more and more countries are going to rely on an interconnected set of constellations. So while, for example, Starlink is being launched by a US company, it's going to have customers and clients throughout the world. Ditto for more and more commercial systems. So it is in the best interest of many, perhaps most countries, to observe norms, even if they're not yet prepared to sign on to those norms in a formal treaty context. Increasingly, I think they will see that the failure to observe these norms will be seen as illegitimate, and it'll be something that essentially illegitimizes their government and their regime. How far this will go and how quickly it will emerge, I don't know. I think Peter Scharfman and I will argue that the way to start is with the norms that are already being observed de facto, where people are attempting to do the right things. Among the norms I would like to see would be better engineering, because I think Matt is absolutely right, again, that we're putting up systems, space, power, weight, and cost are all hard. You add security to this, what is it where are the compromises going to be made? And so I'd like to both insist that better engineering from a security perspective be performed. And frankly, one way of doing that is to lower the cost of that engineering and the features that will emerge. So I want to improve I'd like to diminish the likelihood that countries and actors will violate norms while improving the likelihood that our systems can withstand those violations. I'd like to do it. I'd like to hit it from both ends.
Indeed. And so, Matt, what do you think about Sam's comments here?
Well, just circular, I totally agree with them. I mean, I really do think that those are, I think those are good things. One of the reasons that, we were so concerned, at least America was a concern, because we had the majority of space assets up there and other people didn't. So if our space assets were damaged, it really hurt us disproportionately to other countries. I think that's changing. We're on our 5th or 6th GNSS network. Even as Starlink and Kuiper and Telesat and all these and OneWeb are hot communication networks, people don't talk as much about the 2 or 3 Chinese low Earth orbit constellations, the one that the Russians want to launch. Every country now seems to want to launch low Earth orbit satellites, so they're suddenly quite concerned, I believe, about debris in space, and that's not a bad thing. Going to what Sam was really mentioning, if we're going to really have these norms in space that everyone has to comply with, you want them to have incentives that encourage them to operate appropriately in those cases. As far as designing satellites to be more resilient, couldn't agree more. We provide a lot of information to NASA, to Max's employer there, to help them figure out exactly how low Earth orbit operates, because not many people had been there before us. And so they didn't have a lot of data for it. And what's the situation in those areas, and how might that affect designs in the front end of satellite systems? So just because, by the way, you get hit by a paint chip, you know, despite the movie, you know, Gravity, which is, you know, fun to watch, but maybe a little bit premature. You know, it doesn't necessarily destroy a spacecraft, but you can protect spacecraft to be resilient and not to throw off other pieces. I love Max's concept of I'm hungry, by the way, when he talks about mushrooms. I think I know what I'm having for lunch anyway here, but mycelium sounds like an interesting approach for satellite design in the future, and for making much more resilient systems and not to launch bad systems into space or to stop launching. I mean, one of the things I just say is it's a simple thing. If you have an anomaly in space, don't launch anything more. The problem is a lot of times there's 30 spacecraft on the vehicle ready to go, and more cost of holding them up for a couple months than you have in launching them. So you launch them and say, we'll worry about them later, and we just can't be doing that.
Yeah, indeed. And so, Max, it sounds like you might have some interest, in mushrooms and next generation things.
Well, if nothing else, at least getting Matt some fresh gourmet mushrooms. I'll have to let you know when we're at the nearest farmer's market by you.
So that's one of the benefits of being a member of the Cyber Hero Network. You get free mushrooms. But just more on a substantive note here, I just want to go back to something early on that you said, Matt, that really syncs up with Scott Schober, and that is the security of IoT devices. Scott has a lot of personal experience. He was a victim of a hacker. He's written several books, about it. One of them is called Hacked Again, which you can get on Amazon and everywhere. But Scott, what is your sense about the security of IoT devices, through wireless?
Well, I certainly think it is a concern. And I think the fact that large organizations are now realizing it's such a concern is really, I think, important. In the past, it was, especially in the world of consumer, it was kind of just laughed about. But now with IoT and 5G, with that integration happening, security is starting to get baked in. And I think that's what's really important, especially in the world of satellites, because with satellites, a lot of it is still consumer off-the-shelf hardware that is being put on a percentage of that. It's not all designed from the ground. And there's so many different attack vectors when you think about satellites that we need to keep in mind. This consumer off-the-shelf hardware, that in turn often will talk to the communications, the IoT, the integration of all that stuff. So I think it's imperative that companies spend the money right now while it's on the ground, while it's being designed, to make it more secure, to make it more safe. And really that's become a revenue source for a lot of larger satellite companies. The IoT, the communications part of it is an essential part, because as was mentioned, I think Matt mentioned earlier, really the footprint of our 4G networks, 4G LTE, and what's starting up with 5G, it is very limited as far as what we have global coverage, despite the billions and billions of dollars that have been spent over decades to build out these wireless networks. And on top of it, there's a limited amount of security here. So now when we take it to the next level, up to satellites, using this IoT, these Internet of Things communication that we're going to be dependent on, it's extremely important we get encryption right, that we have the ability to proper security patches to upgrade these IoT devices that these satellites are talking to. And they will be prone to things, as we mentioned before, spoofing and DDoS attacks. And probably the biggest threat is honestly human factor, that a lot of times we forget about. People are part of the big problem, especially who's controlling the stuff on the ground. These ground stations are controlled by people. So we have to look at so many different aspects when we're thinking about IoT, 5G, and this integration into the world of satellites.
Indeed. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Gary. Matt and Scott hit on the topic there that I wanted to bring up. So I think it was Matt that said about how there are so many more satellites going up there because it's becoming cheaper and easier to build. And with working at NASA, I've come to realize that we as builders of satellites and rockets need to understand that what we're building, quite possibly is going to last a lot longer than we are expecting or projecting. The rover's Curiosity and Insight, or not Insight, I can't think of the other one, but those rovers on Mars, they were only expected to last like 30 days or 90 days. And
Wow.
they end up lasting years. If we look back to Voyager, we launched Voyager, I think it was in 1977. It's still communicating with us today. So we need to realize that as we build these systems, that we need to build them for having a very lengthy life cycle, and to make sure that we build our technology with a defense in depth approach. And Matt talked earlier about this there's some satellites that don't have encryption. We probably need to look at that more often, is should we be encrypting that information, even though it might be really nothing of real value or importance, but we need to make sure that the data that we're getting has integrity, and we can't do that unless we encrypt.
Indeed, and as you you mentioned about looking into things, Sam, you wanted to talk a little bit more about the need for further research and development.
Thank you. Well, Gary, this is a topic in which I've been interested, and not just for for space systems, but more broadly. I think we need a whole of nation cyber R&D strategy that includes industry, government, and academia. I don't think we have it yet. Bits and pieces of it are emerging, but if you think about nuclear energy or aerospace or AIDS, we put together a community and identified key challenges and assigned responsibility and allocated resources against them. Space systems are going to be increasingly vital to our national and economic security. And I think that, we're spending a good deal of money to develop these systems. We should make sure that a component of what we're spending and the effort that we put forward is going to be focused on securing these things. There's an old story about Bugatti, the famous car maker in France. And these were high performance cars in the 1920s and 30s, but they still had old fashioned brakes. And when somebody asked Bugatti about it, the line he is reported to have given is, "But madam, I make my cars to go, not to stop. We'll make better brakes next year." But I don't think we can afford that. I think particularly in space systems, given that, more and more of these systems are based on commoditized parts, and the systems themselves are commodities, that, they're not subject to the same kind of research and development cycle that maybe a national security platform, in the past, would have enjoyed. So I think more research and development and ways to take the product of it and apply it in a cost-effective manner is useful. These are not all national security platforms where somebody said, well, securing this is going to cost an extra $2 million. Okay, so it costs an extra $2 million. Here, the results of that research and development have to fit within the business case envelope of the other requirements these systems have to meet. And I think that's a wicked, though interesting challenge, and one that requires an R&D focus.
Indeed. And so as we're wrapping up here, Matt, what other thoughts do you have? Is there anything you'd like to amplify your message, to our audience? And how do people get more information about some of the cool stuff you're doing?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's been an interesting subject, Gary. We could go on for another hour, I think, in a number of other areas that I think are related to space. And so I'm glad we got a chance to spend some time with this group on the subject. I was thinking, going back when I joined the company, cybersecurity really wasn't an issue, and I got a wake-up call. I think one of the things that you get in this business when you spend any kind of time at it, you get a sense of paranoia constant. I think that's an element of problem.
Well, yeah, but hold on. Paranoia is an unfounded concern. Let's call it vigilance.
Yeah, vigilance. I guess that's maybe an important way to do it. But you worry every day, because no matter how hard you work at it, you never can be done. And so using words like protecting, is a difficult word, because you have to just keep creating boundaries of increasing boundaries of making it difficult for the A team and some other operator to really want to get there. And unfortunately, we spent an awful lot of time and money. I totally, by the way, agree with the human threat aspect of it. One of the things I find an advantage is I have 500 employees. I worry about these companies with 30,000. I mean, that,
Right.
look at the NSA. It's not an easy target, but all it took is one employee who decided to go rogue. So it's one of those things, knowing who you're operating, who's operating your network, how they're operating. I could go on and on. I would say if people are interested in Iridium just as a service and what we do, obviously our website iridium.com is available. I also encourage people to look at our history a little bit, which is actually a separate one called iridiummuseum.com, which kind of goes through the unique history of the company that goes back into the 90s and how we got here and that sort of thing. But definitely glad to be part of this great panel.
Well, thank you so much. And talking about the people part of this, Scott, this is something that you're really uniquely qualified to talk about, and we'll show up on your screen some of your books. So tell us, just in closing, some thoughts about kind of the human element.
Well, I think it's really important, and it's probably we focus too much sometimes on technology and building up a strong cyber stance with different type of defenses that can be reactive to things. All those things are really important, but sometimes we forget that critical asset, the employees, as Matt was just touching on. We got to educate everybody within our organization, everyone from the janitor to the CEO, on best cyber practices, especially in organizations that are building something as important as a satellite and maintaining it. The way I view the satellites, they're really, the world's critical infrastructure is really dependent upon space, because that is clearly the future, and it's here and now. And all these space-based assets, just for basic operation, for daily functioning, and it really is encompassing everything from air transport, financial services. We mentioned weather monitoring, defense, communications. That's all really dependent upon our future of space and making sure that it stays safe. And one other point that really popped out in my mind as we were chatting about it, keeping it safe up there. There's the human side, keeping this all safe from the critical infrastructure, but even the debris. I think we mentioned the floating debris and satellites, all things that are legacy and out. I did a quick search, and there's over 27,000 pieces of space junk or orbital debris that is kind of out there that have to be monitored, and the Department of Defense carefully monitors that just so nothing crashes into anything else. And it's very well orchestrated, and it is safe, but it takes an enormous amount of people behind that to monitor it and make sure things don't crash and blow up. So again, we're heavily dependent upon the people aspect. So that's always part of the equation. We don't want to just try to leave it up to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automated systems, because we're a critical part of that. And I think that's important for us all to remember going forward.
Indeed. And how does our audience get more information about some of the great stuff you're doing, Scott?
Well, certainly my company is simply the website, B as in boy, V as in Victor, and then systems spelled out, or then some of the other stuff there that parallels it in cybersecurity. It's simply my name, scottschober.com.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. And Max, what do you think we need to have our audience understand about some of the amazing work that you and your team are doing over at NASA?
Sure. So what we do really is based on two things: people, process, and technology. And it's in that order for a reason. And Scott was really talking about, as well as Matt, everything that we do is really about people. It's people who build their systems. It's people who design their solutions. And there's 7.2 or 7.4 billion people in this world, and none of them think alike. And we have to remember that when we build our solutions, that we're building for people.
Yeah, indeed. And Max, your connection's a little bit choppy. We'll try to come back to you in a second as we're just wrapping up. And Sam, you'll have the last word, unless we go back to Max for a second.
Well, thank you. I don't always get the last word. I think this has been a very interesting panel and useful. The bottom line is we're going to be more dependent on space systems every day. They're going to be worth $1 trillion in our economy. We're going to need them for national security and for national economic security. Those systems are not as well protected as they need to be. It's a whole of nation effort to protect them. It's vital that we declare them to be a critical infrastructure sector. I think we should support that effort to the maximum extent that is possible. I know that the work we're doing at MITRE and Space ISAC is consistent with the importance of this sector. And I think that the importance of this sector is only going to grow. And if we don't secure it, we will fail to do so at our peril. And if we do it, it'll really be another real victory for the field as well as for the nation. Thank you.
Indeed, that's terrific. Max, I think your echo is have to lower your echo. Yeah.
I think once we start talking, it reduced because I didn't change any settings. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, your connection is a little bit off, so no worries. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, let me end by saying, on behalf of a grateful digital universe, thanks so much to our special guests, Max Justice and Matt Desch and Sam Vissner and Scott Schober, for being the real life unsung cyber heroes that our mission is dedicated to. And so if all of you can just stay on for a minute, we'll make sure that you have one another's contact information because a rising tide does lift all ships. And I'm making a spontaneous sort of decision here based on the substance and the importance of what we just heard. We're going to launch one of our micro think tanks, and it's going to be securing space, because we went here for about an hour or so. This is something that is mission critical to everything about our planet. And I'd like to personally close amplifying the notes that all of you said, wishing our thoughts and prayers to the brave men and women who served this country in silence in Afghanistan, and also their families. So on behalf of a grateful digital universe, Gary Berman signing off.